Good evening, everyone. My name is Tino Cuellar. I have the great honor of being the president of this institution, the Carnegie Endowment. Before I say a word or two about one of my favorite colleagues, our vice president for Russia and Eurasia, just want to say a quick word about Julia Ioffe, who's going to be interviewing him. I read her work in Puck. You should read Puck. That's about as much free advertising as you're going to get. That's it. But I will note that the tradition we have here at Carnegie of engaging people who are journalists, commentators to work with us and to give us some insights of what's happening in the world is nicely represented in Julia. She does terrific work, has a good textured insight for what's happening in DC and elsewhere, is, I know, educated at Princeton, I gather, worked at the New Yorker, has done some really cool things in her life, and we're very glad that you can join us today. And I know you'll be kind to Andrew, so treat him well. So when I was on the Supreme Court of California, I made it a point to try to extend the reach of the institution to talk to different kinds of audiences. And that meant often getting out of my comfort zone, far away from the court, going to places that were pretty remote, past the Russian River to Modoc County, talking to high school students, to community college students. And one day I got an email mentioning that the person who was emailing had noticed that I was trying to do a great deal of outreach explaining how the courts worked, what the rule of law was, how technology was disrupting the rule of law and providing new opportunities to engage with the world as well, how democracy is changing. This person said, I have an idea for you. You should take that message to a place where no judge has gone before, and that's Comic-Con in San Diego, which was, at the time, one of the premier conferences to talk about science fiction and comics and other stuff. I debated this a little bit with my team and decided I was going to take the plunge. I didn't know exactly what to expect, but I do remember showing up and realizing that there were 500 people in the room waiting to talk to me about Star Trek and the rule of law. I had my nice little yellow Star Trek shirt with a little Starfleet logo. But as I looked out into the room, I saw that about a quarter of the 500 people were dressed in full Star Trek costume. I seriously thought that I was in Starfleet. When I left the Supreme Court of California, I had many thoughts. I was a little nostalgic. I loved the court, but I was excited to come to Carnegie. But the one thing I thought was for certain is that I would be joining an establishment where no one would ever go to Comic-Con. I was wrong. Not only do I have a terrific, thoughtful, patient, and brilliant colleague who has gone to Comic-Con, but he has actually done something I have not done, which is written an amazing graphic novel. Now, let me say a word or two about this graphic novel and why I'm impressed with it, and then I'll say a word or two about Andrew, and then I'll shut up and you can listen to him and Julia. So I know that the most difficult work for a think tank to do, I get the sense from my colleagues, is to bridge the divide between what the world understands and what the world needs to understand. The complexity of making sense of a place like Russia with its 6 million square miles and its complicated and messy history and its almost never entirely stable political dynamic is not something you can easily do in a single briefing, in a particular academic paper, but it's particularly challenging to do that in a different medium where you're actually trying to connect with audiences that Carnegie does not normally connect with. And at the same time, I should add, illuminating to those of us who are wrapping our minds around international politics in more conventional ways, different ways of thinking about this. So I really am struck by how the rhetoric that we sometimes use about engaging with new audiences, finding new ways to communicate, finding new ways to stimulate thought, have actually been captured in what Andrew has done. Not only that, but he's picked a terrific graphic artist to work with him, whose work I recommend and have come across at Comic-Con before, and I will not be surprised when they make this into a movie at some point. You heard it here first. Andrew has managed to do this at a time when the situation with Russia can get more complicated, more messy, and of course the news that has been playing out even in the last couple of hours highlights that. So as I wrap up my already too long introduction, I just want to say that I have great admiration for Andrew and his team for the calm and direction and intense focus that they have kept as we have gone through a set of challenges with our own work, not only because our scholars are in such demand, but because for 29 years we had a Moscow center, and we now have had to deal with its closure, not our choice. And Andrew has been hard at work, dedicated, making sure that we build up what will be a new hub in Berlin, and that every single day that he's out there doing his work, he's also looking out for the team that we have. And for that, on behalf of the institution, I'm particularly grateful. I'm also grateful that I gather that this is only his first graphic novel, so I look forward to more. So with that, welcome, Julia and Andrew. Thank you for doing this.
All right. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Andrew, thank you for writing a graphic novel. So I've been talking to you for a very long time. You are one of the most astute, nuanced, careful, witty observers of Russia that I know. And I often call you to talk about Russia, to get a comment about Russia for a piece. And when you told me a couple of years ago that you were going to do a graphic novel about it, I have to admit it was a bit of a head scratcher, because you were always, you were a serious person, capital S, capital P. Not that, serious people don't write graphic novels, but I thought it was, an interesting choice of a medium, especially for a Washington serious. Why did you decide to pick this particular medium?
Well, first of all, it's great to see you. I'm grateful to Tino, and I'm grateful to see so many friends in the audience, and presumably tuning in as well. So this is really a special moment for me, and I'm incredibly grateful. The challenge of wonky people who are fortunate enough to work in institutions like Carnegie is being able to look in the mirror and say, who are we reaching? And oftentimes, a lot of our work is aimed at pretty narrow groups of people, and also a lot of the time our work, frankly, is kind of insular, and we're talking mainly to each other and people who are already, either well-versed or knowledgeable about what we're working on. And I wanted to break out of that insularity, and I love graphic novels. I'm not like the biggest graphic novel nerd out there, but what I've seen in a few of the really, really pivotal graphic novels that are out there is they're able to talk about hard subjects. They're able to reach different segments of the world. So they can reach young people, they can reach people who read the newspaper and who are really fixated, for example, on the outsized impact that Putin is having on our world today. And they can reach specialists. And the way I wrote the book, I approached it with the same kind of scholarly techniques that I use for my day job. So there's declassified documents, there's Russian historical information, there's memoirs, so it uses and weaves together the same kinds of facts to make the big arguments that I wanted to make about Vladimir Putin.
I also noticed, I'm just reminded again, looking at it, that you got a blurb from Madeleine Albright. So she got to read this before she went to the next world. How did you get this into her hands? What did she think of the novel?
Madeleine Albright was a great friend and mentor to me over the years, and I had the privilege of working with her both in government and then after government. And I also got to go to the movies with Madeleine Albright. And so I'll just say this to everyone, because it was a very memorable thing, and I miss her dearly. We went to see this utter bum out of a movie, Leviathan, about life in provincial Russia.
I cried my face off after watching that movie. Yep.
Mm-hmm. And this most telling detail of the story is when Madeleine and I got to the movie theater, the Avalon Theater in DC, she said, well, we need to do some vodka shots before the movie. And so that is literally what we did before going into this utterly depressive movie. But so anyway, so it was incredibly gracious of her to give me this kind of, pat on the shoulder.
That's amazing. It's really amazing to see it now, especially. So the other thing that I thought when I saw this published is, wow, another Putin biography. It is on one hand very timely. On the other hand, there have been a lot of Putin biographies, which at the same time, Americans seem to get enough of. And this man who has been so, he talks a lot. He tells us a lot about what he thinks, and he has been written about a lot in many languages. He still seems to be so mysterious and hard to understand for the American public. Why do you think that is? Why do you think Americans still can't really wrap their heads around Vladimir Putin?
To quick thoughts. The first is it's a feature, not a bug, of the way the Kremlin operates and the way Russian leaders operate to have all this mystique and to create a level of, the sort of pageantry and mystery about what makes them tick. And so if you ask people today, what is Russia trying to achieve in Ukraine? We actually don't know because we have these propagandistic slogans like denazification, whatever that means, but we don't have.
Although we don't hear that as much anymore.
But we don't have like a speech that articulates a set of achievable, clear policy goals, right? So that's part one, is the czar always has to be special. And I think that is part of what makes understanding Putin difficult, is that they don't want you to know, and the story keeps changing. And a big part of this book was to tell the story of how when Putin first lucked into the job of a lifetime of being selected to be Boris Yeltsin's replacement, the Kremlin had to come up with some explanation of who this guy was. And so they fell back on a couple of things that I thought were really interesting for the book. One was they had done focus groups with average Russians to try to figure out, well, what are the qualities of a leader that you would like? And their previous incumbent, Boris Yeltsin, was a total booze hound. So they wanted to find out what would make the Russian people support a replacement who came out of nowhere. And the Russian people picked basically, well, we want this kind of character from Soviet pop culture who was a KGB operative who had wormed his way into the Nazi high command, Colonel Sturlitz. And they then went about looking for someone to play that role. And they were like, Putin, you can be that guy. You can play that role. And so there was a certain randomness to it. I don't want to take anything away from Putin in terms of the loyalty he had displayed to the Yeltsin family.
He just lost Gibson. Don't take anything else from him.
And I didn't want to diminish the fact that he, was willing to play ball with the Yeltsin family, which wanted protection and wanted someone in this job who would not sell them out. And Putin delivered. And for the first several years, first term in office, he basically kept things as they were under Yeltsin. But what was striking me, and the last point I'll make, is that they dressed up Putin in all these accoutrements of being a super spy. And they gave him guns, and they had him fly in a jet fighter. And what was supposed to be reassuring to the Russian people after having endured the Yeltsin era was in many ways taken up in the West as literal. And I think the cartoonishness we have in the West often bought into as, well, that's the actual guy. He must have been a high flyer in the KGB. He must be a man of action. And the reality is much more complicated than that.
Right, and then eventually we got the shirtless guy on a horse, who you have on the cover, kind of, right, which was then photoshopped onto a bear, and then there was him photoshopped with Trump also shirtless on the horse. I don't know if you remember in 2016. That was a meme that was going around. That was one of my favorites. How did that myth evolve over the last 22 years now, almost 23?
I think the Russian government has had a run of successes under Putin, and there was a long streak until this disastrous criminal war where Putin was riding high. And you had, if you look
shirtless on a horse.
Shirtless on a horse. And if you look at, basically a decade of remarkable successes in the first two terms of incredible economic gains. So, Russia was richer than it had ever been in the 1,000 years that it had been around. People enjoyed a level of prosperity and modernity that they never had enjoyed. And then after 2013, depending on when you want to date this, but I'd say with the Snowden affair, they had this kind of endless series of sticking it to the United States. And that really made Putin happy. In 2015, you had the intervention in Syria. 2016, you had Russian interference in the US presidential election, which caused, a level of chaos here. It wasn't their authorship, but certainly they were a great beneficiary of all the chaos caused during the Trump presidency. And then in 2018, you had, a sort of moment, I think, where Putin, had run out of gas and had really stopped governing. And it's not clear to me what caused it, if it was his work from home experience in the pandemic, or the sort of effects of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. But he saw another moment where here's my chance to redress this big concern, the unfinished business that Eugene Rumor and I wrote about.
Yes.
I will bring Ukraine back into Russia's orbit by force. And as the West is in disarray and the Biden administration is too weak, I will create a new reality. And it was the most epic blunder and miscalculation of any global leader, maybe with the exception of George W. Bush and the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah. Which is still playing, I mean, the Ukraine miscalculation is still playing out today. I mean, we just saw missiles landing in Poland, killing 2 people, and the Kremlin furiously moonwalking that back and telling Poland to stop hitting itself, essentially. But I wanted to get at the kind of the premise. I mean, it's in the title that Putin is an accidental Tsar, which, you know, you said you didn't want to take anything away from Putin. He was incredibly ambitious, and he was also working in parallel to get higher and higher and higher in the Yeltsin hierarchy. And, you know, there was also the matter of the 1999 apartment bombings and the war in Chechnya. And to what extent do you think Putin created his own luck and created the accident that made him Tsar?
I really do think Putin is the luckiest man on the planet, both in terms of getting this job in the first place and then the series of successes that he's enjoyed. And anyone who would have predicted, and I can remember being in these kinds of conversations when I was a staffer in the government, the idea that he would ever become that person. This was a guy who had a very low-key, understated nature. He was not a public figure. He had no political experience. He had none of this kind of larger-than-life dimension to his personality. So the idea that any of this was foreordained and that it was just a matter of pushing is and he was someone who was a hard worker and was very diligent and distinguished himself in the chaos of the Yeltsin years because he was such a hard worker. But I just don't see it as that was the something that different Putin biographers have told it differently. Mm-hmm. Some people say this was all part of a KGB takeover of Russia and that it was part of some big conspiracy. I just don't see a ton of information that corroborates that. Mm. But I accept that Russia is a society run by conspiracies and that people believe in all sorts of things and engage in all sorts of machinations. And because it's Russia, we'll never know. And no one's going to tell you the truth.
Right. From the American side, and you were, in government for part of this time, this was something that was then rehashed so much when Putin went into Ukraine in February of this year. What, in these last 22 years that he was becoming Tsar and creating and recreating himself, molting before our eyes, what could we in the West have done differently? Could we have understood him better? Could we have handled him better? Could we have dealt with his various iterations better?
I think Putin is a walking, breathing grievance. And no matter what the US does, he's got a beef with us. And a lot of this is in his head, but it is also rooted in a view that the United States seeks nothing less than his ouster, and that the true endpoint and goal of Western policy is regime change in the Kremlin. And so if you start from that point, and at times he's felt more uneasy on the throne today, I think he feels actually rather comfortable on the throne and feels less sense of threat. And that, in either situation, it fosters a kind of lashing out and a desire to kind of keep adversaries off balance. And so it's a much better strategy for him overall to try to cut America down to size, to try to discredit us, to throw us off balance, and then to use these asymmetrical tools, because he knows, if he stacks himself against the United States, that he's far outclassed. The problem that we as Americans often engage in is that, A, we kind of are self-critical, and we're like, oh, we really wish this had gone differently. People in the US government expended enormous amounts of energy in the 1990s trying to make things better with Russia and trying to help Russia make the transition. It was a situation where our own expectations were out of line with Russian reality, and we got a miserable result. But the Russian government has fomented a sense of humiliation and grievance inside the entire population and inside the elite, instead of thinking, wow, this was great. We had a pretty benign relationship with the US. The US really isn't out to get us that much, and Russia can focus inward on getting its act together. And now that was, for the best telling detail of this is if you ask people how many US tanks were in Europe when the war in Ukraine started in 2014, the answer is 0. And so now Russia has brought to life a moribund US-led military alliance, which is going to make it less secure for decades to come. So to me, it all just, again, suggests Putin is someone who didn't think this all through, who made a lot of impulsive, wrong-headed decisions, and we're now all having to clean up the mess.
So were you pre-February 24th, were you in the Putin is a master strategist camp or no?
No, not
Yeah,
so much.
okay, so you
Not
were in
much.
my camp. Tell me more.
No, I mean, so Eugene Rumor, my colleague who's here today, and I wrote a paper in October of 2021 outlining why we thought this was the single biggest piece of unfinished business. On
Which was
Putin's
an
stance.
excellent paper.
Thank you. And it really tried to explain
And was
to people.
quoted in a Puck newsletter.
Thank God. And it, to us, was a moment where, there was a sense for Putin of threat that over time, the US and Western support for Ukraine would just continue to mushroom and grow. There was an opportunity, like as we talked a moment ago, about the wake of the collapse of the Ghani government in Afghanistan. The Zelensky government was mired in endless self-inflicted crises. And then there was this sense, right or wrong, but I think largely just completely Putin, that I understand history. And you've seen this in the Russian elite in the last 5 or 7 years, this fixation on Molotov-Ribbentrop wasn't so bad, or Russia wasn't the bad guy, or Russia and Ukraine were all one people, and just this pseudo-history, and marinating yourself during work from home COVID in things that are fallacious, that are just demonstrably false, and then being the leader of a country with no checks and balances. And so Putin, on a whim, came up with a plan to invade Ukraine, did it with a military footprint that was completely not up for the challenge, and faced an adversary that was going to fight and die for its independence. And he's going to bear the cost of that now for the rest of his days.
Yeah. Well, and turned parts of Ukraine that were originally quite sympathetic to him and to Russia into, I mean, you saw Kherson, these women wearing, yellow and blue traditional Ukrainian headdresses, welcoming Ukrainian troops. This was a city that was quite sympathetic to Russia even after 2014.
No, I mean,
Very
for generations to
brilliant
come,
strategy.
for generations to come, he has, engendered a level of hostility that you'd have to go to like the Arab-Israeli conflict to match.
Yeah.
And the war crimes and the horrible atrocities committed by Russians all across Ukraine, not just in Bucha, will confirm that to everybody in Ukraine. There's no fence sitting really in Ukraine anymore.
Yeah. So back to the book. Who is the target audience for this? This amazing, very, I would say almost clairvoyant paper that you and Eugene wrote back in the fall, well, about this time last year, about what awaited us and Putin in Ukraine. That was, I think, for people like us. But who is this book for?
This book is aimed at maybe 3 different audiences. And I should give a shout out to Brian Box-Brown, the illustrator, who really propelled the ideas I had into this visual form in a totally genius and creative way. The goal of writing a book like this, as I was saying at the beginning, is to reach different audiences than would read a think tank policy paper. But I think if you're someone who reads the newspaper and who's really focused on what's happened in and out of the past year and really focused on the threat Russia poses globally, there's a lot here that will put all of those issues in proper context. It will give you a sense of why expansionism has been at the heart of the Russian state for centuries, why Russia has used territorial encroachment as a way to defend itself and to kind of fend off adversaries. It will explain why the country focuses on having a centralized, very one-man rule and lack of real institutions as a way of ruling a country's expanse that is so big as Russia in geographic terms. And then for younger people, I think, frankly, they've been subjected to a lot of cartoonish portrayals of Russia and Putin, especially in the wake of the 2016 election. And a lot of that is unfortunately misleading because it makes Russia seem more formidable than it actually is. It makes Putin seem 10 feet tall. And it also potentially sets up this idea that, we must be in a kind of shadow struggle like we were in the Cold War against a peer competitor. Russia is something less than a peer competitor. It's not China in military terms, in economic terms, obviously, in technological terms. It's very menacing and disruptive, but we should not allow ourselves to kind of be caught up in these one-dimensional portraits. And that's really a big part of what the book is trying to do.
So this younger generation, what is the picture of Russia you want them to come away with? Okay, they're not China, they're not a peer competitor, but how should they see Putin? How should they see Russia and Russians, especially in the wake of February 24th?
I really liked the way President Biden described Putin early in his tenure. As he said, he's a worthy adversary. And that is significant. It shows that we understand, by dint of Russia's nuclear and other exquisite military capabilities, that Russia is serious and we have to deal with that threat. At the same time, we should not give Russia the things it wants and roll over when Russia overreaches. And so we're seeing that in this debate right now in Washington that's been in circulation of, we should really call this war to an end, we should have negotiations. So I think it's really important for people, especially younger people, who are just hearing these things for the first time to really understand why it may not be possible to negotiate with someone like Vladimir Putin over Ukraine, and why it certainly wouldn't be appropriate for the people of Ukraine to be expected to give in to someone who has done the horrible things in their country that Vladimir Putin has done. So that we need to really think strategically about this challenge. And part of, I don't want to give anything away about the book, but we should keep pinning our hopes on these magical events. There have been no splits in the Russian elite. No one has risen up on their hind legs and said, I can't take it anymore. These atrocities are so bad. Please stop. No one in the streets of Russia in significant numbers has come out to say you can't take our kids to this criminal war. So there's a lot of inertia and passivity and paternalism that drives the way Russian society and elites respond to things like this horrible war. And I think people need to understand that instead of thinking, one more sanction, one more thing that we pile on, or one more tweet, and the Russians are going to start cowering and recalibrating what they're doing.
Yeah, I even heard this from Russians, which was also a very passive approach from them at the beginning of the war, the tabakirka hope. That somebody would come up behind Putin and hit him in the back of the head with a tabakirka, a snuff box, right, and just knock him out, and that would end the war. That, of course, has not happened. Given that Russia tends to solve its own problems, and that usually tends to come from the elites, from inside the elites, how do you think this does end? That it doesn't end with a tweet from us and with another sanction from us. How does this end?
I think the main solution is the actuarial table. Vladimir Putin is only 70 years old. He's got a relatively healthy lifestyle compared to previous Russian leaders, and is going to be around for a while. It's a rickety system, and so things could happen. There still are exogenous events that could make this system come unglued. But simply wondering what it is we can do, like what piece of investigative journalism, what revelation about the corruption and moral decay of the Russian leadership can we unveil, and somehow the Russian people will all come into the streets, like those are probably not the realistic tools. The realistic tools to combat this are the military support for Ukraine and their noble cause to push the Russian invasion back. It is our own resolve and how we manage a dangerous adversary. So today's news about the missile strikes in Poland are obviously a big call on people like President Biden to be judicious and careful and not give in to provocations, but at the same time demonstrate that Russia doesn't have total leeway to be this menacing drunk in the bar and forcing everyone to back off. And that was a big part of, I think, we saw this very vividly in the Western response to all of this gratuitous nuclear saber-rattling, to show that the West doesn't take these kinds of threats lightly, and that Russia will not break our will and will not be able to fracture the Western coalition that's supporting Ukraine just because it's threatening to do something completely irrational, like use nuclear weapons.
Right. I also wanted to ask you before we go to the audience for questions, some of the most incredible, impactful work you've done is in running the Carnegie Center in Moscow and in hiring and empowering and giving salaries, frankly, and a platform to young, brilliant Russians to write and think and create and to comment on their own country and what it is that's happening inside their own country. And I keep thinking about the piece that Anne Applebaum wrote, I think this week, about basically the failure of the Russian liberals. And it's something that has been debated since February 24th by Russian liberals themselves.
Since 1812.
Well, yeah, yes. But you have been a major pillar of support for Russian liberals. Do you see the war in Ukraine as a failure of Russian liberals? Could they have done anything to prevent this war?
The people of Russia in the elite, the people of Russia in this liberal segment of society, which is pretty small, you're describing, don't have any authority. They are not a shock absorber for Putin's bad ideas. They are not a source of analytical counterbalancing or truth-telling that exposes the dumbness and the wrong-headedness of what their leaders are pursuing. So I think it's expecting a lot in a system like Russia, which is personalistic, which is secretive, and which is non-inclusive, to expect that writing the great op-ed will rattle people the way a great op-ed might damage confidence in a Western government in its actions. Two, we have seen over a long period that people in Carnegie are able to reach mass audiences in Russia. And the new project we just recently launched, Carnegie Politica, is now doing 2x or 3x the audience of what Carnegie Rue used to do. So we have an audience of people, Russian-speaking people, because that's who's primarily the readers of what we do, that's on a massive scale in the millions.
And is that through VPNs that people are accessing this?
We're not blocked, and it is just, it's just a great virtuous cycle. The more we produce, the more people want to consume, and the content is, in Russian we'd say aktualny, it's like on topic, and that's just a great virtuous cycle. I don't think that analysis is what will, or could have tipped Putin's pseudo-history and work-from-home experience during COVID. And you look at the ways Putin writes and talks about Ukraine, and it's fanciful. And it's a world of grievance and false conspiracy ascribed to us, and it's a world in which he believes that the Ukrainians really want Russia back. And it shows that it's a man who's learned nothing. He's lost Ukraine 2004 in the Orange Revolution. He lost it again in 2014 in the Revolution of Dignity. He's now permanently caused, an endless amount of harm and rupture and suffering. And he still thinks that somehow you can find a Ukrainian leader who you can corrupt or bamboozle into suborning the independent streak of the people of Ukraine. It's really tragic that he genuinely seems to believe that. And that, to my mind, what we haven't really got an answer to is how will we deal with Russia as a society and a political entity for decades to come, because we're not necessarily going to get those people put on trial in The Hague, and they are going to be around. And the thing that ended the wars in the Balkans, where we had people like Slobodan Milosevic pursuing equally quasi-genocidal agendas, was the U.S. military intervention. And we've seen in this particular case that that's not on the table. And the U.S. is only going to help the Ukrainians up to a certain point.
Well, because this is coming after Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're tapped out. I guess.
And the risk of escalation, and the president sees that.
Slobodan Milosevic didn't have nukes.
Exactly.
But I just want to push you a little bit more on the Russian liberals. I think it's precisely the point that op-eds were never going to get him. And I think that was the point of people like Navalny, which was stop writing op-eds, go out and actually do something and organize and go out into the streets. And we've also seen that was not effective. Is there anything that could have stopped Putin? Is there anything that could have stopped the war internally?
I don't see any shock absorbers to Putin's actions and everything Putin has done up to this point. The only times there are people in the audience who know Russia better than I do. I see a couple of them in the room. Maybe they can point out examples. Okay. I think there were protests against changes to social benefits. So there were these kind of meat and potato things like who rides the metro for free and what you're doing to your pension and things like that. But there are almost no instances in the Putin era where the government was thwarted and where this kind of decorative level of Russian society of liberals who lived, kind of a Western lifestyle and a European lifestyle hemmed in whatever mess Vladimir Putin was pursuing. And the technocrats, who are the financial and economic backbone of the regime, their job is to clean up messes and to kind of make the boss able to, dust himself off and go off and do the next bad thing.
Yeah. And why do you think Putin is more secure on the throne now than he was before?
Well, he opened the borders and scared out anybody who might be in that Navalny rabble-rousing world. So anyone who had marketable skills or worldly background or high level of education and employability, they were all free to leave. So we've seen an outmigration of the best and the brightest. You have a process of adverse selection in terms of the people who stayed behind.
Classic.
Yep. So the Russians are not dumb about how they pursue authoritarianism. They have a different model than the Chinese. They're very selective and very targeted. So they use one or two examples of sadism to get everyone to fall in line. And then you see this kind of level of passivity and self-protection in the micro level within Russian society. Some of that's breaking down as a result of the mass mobilization of people to go fight. But even there, I have not seen anything near the level of sort of uproar within Russian society or protest about people being sent off into the meat grinder in Ukraine. Like it just, we see some videos of people, saying the conditions are bad, but I haven't seen anyone saying, let's get rid of the leadership that is pursuing a criminal war in Ukraine.
Yeah, now that we have these rusty guns, let's use them against our generals. Last question about the book. Have your kids read it, or are they too young?
This is a controversial issue in the House at the
Yes.
moment, and we're working on them. They're big readers, but they're not like the biggest graphic novel readers. Believe it or not, yeah.
Oh no. Yeah. So, but they have to, right?
Their parents would like them to read it. Yeah.
Okay. Is it age appropriate?
Yeah, no,
I've lost track of. Are they in college? And I feel like other people's kids grow at terrifying paces.
No, my kids are in 3rd grade and 7th grade, so they.
Is this age appropriate for them? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
So
What do you hope they learn from it, other than that
they're
their dad is
sick
so
of hearing-
brilliant?
They're so sick of hearing their dad talk about Russia.
Oh, really?
They would kill for a different dinner time conversation.
They want to hear about Xi Jinping?
Yeah, good one. Yeah, yeah. We should work on that tonight.
Okay. All right. Let's open it up to questions. Who wants to ask questions? Sir.
We have microphones coming around.
Yeah.
Hi, Andrew.
Hey.
Michael Gordon, Wall Street Journal. There have been a number of interactions between American and Russian officials, Jake Sullivan and Patrushev, which the White House didn't disclose officially, Bill Burns and his counterpart. I don't know if that's been disclosed yet or not. Ostensibly, these are about issuing warnings on the nuclear front, but they provide an opportunity to explore red lines on the Russian side. My question for you is, given Putin's involvement, his psychic, political involvement in the Ukraine enterprise and his worldview, what do you think is his bottom line? What is the most one could expect him to do by way of a negotiation if one was ever to be inculcated? Could he go back to February? Could he ever conceivably give up Crimea? Or are those sorts of concessions only conceivable if Putin is no longer in power?
Great question, Michael, and really nice to see you. We don't know is the easy answer. There's been a series of moments in the first phase of the war when I can remember really vividly, I think it was in Davos in 2015, where members of the entourage of then Ukrainian President Poroshenko said, we don't think Russia actually knows what it wants either. And there's, the Russians really have kept their cards either close to the vest or they haven't figured out what their irreducible minimum is. Putin, though, in the last several months, I'd say in the last 6 weeks, has been running around basically saying to anyone who'll listen, look, if you just let us have the territory we control now and that we've annexed or we've laid claim to, we can have a ceasefire and we can kind of bring the temperature down. So he's running around offering that up. It's not a viable proposition. There's no way the Ukrainians are going to go for it. But they're trying, the Russians are trying, to sell that bridge, and there just ain't no takers for it. The problem, in my mind, and I don't think we know the answer, is how much of the attachment to what's been conquered since 2014 is cardinal for him, and actually important, and how much of it is just part of this bargaining that Putin thinks he's conducting with an imaginary Ukrainian counterpart. I honestly don't know. And when I look at things like the seizure of Crimea, the Russians have invented a whole mythology about the importance of Crimea after 2014 as a form of self-justification and as a form of self-aggrandizement to say, good job.
They said Jesus was from Crimea. Do you remember that one? I'm serious. I'm serious.
I forgot that. Yeah. So that is the problem of who we're dealing with, is it's a lot of trial and error, it's a lot of improvisation, and it's a lot of questions about leverage. And ultimately, this war will come down to the leverage that Russia is going to have to confront with a capable, well-armed Ukraine that's going to be feisty and isn't going to be seeking the best bad deal at this stage of the war. Things may, this war, if it drags on, may have chapters that are unpredictable in which Ukraine doesn't look as formidable as it does today. But if you were on the Russian side, you had your conventional military shredded, and you had a sense of that this isn't going to end anytime soon, that like the Ukrainians will never relent and give in. It's not clear to me where the exit for Putin is. And that just makes me more worried about escalation, frankly.
Sir?
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Steve Flanagan from Rand and Georgetown University. Andrew, congratulations on the book. I wanted to ask you, as you are looking at the cartoon behind you, even Putin with his AK, as you worked with your illustrator to develop your cartoon Putin, did you get any flash of insights in thinking about other aspects of his character or thinking worldview, perhaps about his wonder weapons that sprang to light or gave you new perspective as you developed this approach to your new analytic approach? Thanks.
So Steve is a former senior intelligence officer, so yeah. So thank you for the kudos on my new trade craft. I don't think the book breaks any new ground about trying to understand how Putin's external presentation reveals much about what his choices will be going forward. What it reveals to me is that we have to strip back all the grandiosity. We have to kind of see the real Putin, which is a guy who's very cunning, who's very nimble, who's very tactical, and who's making it up most of the time. And there's been a tendency for us to internalize the things that the Russians transmit, like, we're surrounded by NATO. And then we start to internalize and think, well, maybe we are surrounding them, and maybe we are the source of their insecurity. I think that insecurity is sort of baked in, and the sense of grievance is baked in. And if you go back and you remember when Obama made his first visit to Moscow, and Putin just like lectured him for 90 minutes about all the things America had done wrong to Russia, supposedly. That is who he is. And the problem is the things that make him shift gears are pressure or resolve or leverage. And we as a policy apparatus in the West, broadly speaking, have not really prioritized creating leverage. And that's really the sine qua non for an effective policy.
I think this.
Hi, Daniela Cheslow, Wall Street Journal. You mentioned that Putin is kind of an accidental czar and that that Ukraine is a huge blunder for him. And I wonder if there are other moments in his career that kind of foreshadowed this before the current invasion of Ukraine.
It's a great question. The thing to me, which I keep coming back on, which is literally the first scene in the book, is the moment when Putin has been in the KGB for 10 years. He's been dreaming of going into the KGB since high school, when he got infatuated with Soviet pop culture glorifying the KGB. And so then he gets in finally, and he has no good jobs for 10 years. And he's been wanting to go overseas. He speaks German. And he finally, after 10 years of these sort of second-tier jobs in Leningrad, goes into the training program for overseas assignments in Moscow. And when he's home in Leningrad on a weekend visit, he gets into a fight on the subway with some random person who's picking on him, and he breaks his arm in the subway fight. And the book opens, and the scene with him and his best friend, who's a classical musician of dubious reputation, named Sergei Roldugan. But he's sitting on the subway with Roldugan, and he's saying, I think there's going to be some really bad consequences from this fight, and my people in Moscow are not going to understand me. having done this. And in fact, instead of staying in the training program for another couple of years, which would have been standard, he leaves the training program after only 1 year, and he ends up in Dresden, which is like a second or third tier foreign assignment in East Germany at the time. And so to me, that just shows something about the impulsivity and emotionalism and the hot-headed streak. It doesn't mean that he can't be nimble, cunning, and very tactical and very agile and do things well, but it does suggest that there are times when his emotions get the best of him. And that's what makes the current moment really scary, because the things he's doing don't make sense. Like launching a war in Ukraine doesn't make sense. Creating a open-ended military confrontation with the United States doesn't make sense. But yet, that's where we're going to be for a very long time.
Wait, but before we do, can I jump in on that? That scene comes from A Первого лица, right? Which
Yep.
is also a bit of work by political technologists, right? The spin doctors that the Kremlin hired to sell Putin to the population in the 3 months that they had between his appointment as Yeltsin's successor and his first election as president. That document is so fascinating to me, and I have often turned to it for the same reasons that you have, and I wonder what you think of it as a source.
Every source you get from Russia has to be treated with abundant skepticism. The Kremlin is constantly rewriting Putin's biography. Mm-hmm. There was a great article in Project Media, which I think Bob Otto sent to me not too long ago, about the embellishment and reinvigoration of different biographical accounts, even to this day, on the eve of Putin's 70th birthday, just a few months ago, in October, I guess. So all these documents treat with abundant skepticism. The pattern, though, of Putin's underperformance in the KGB is really clear. And we'll never know, like, they don't have declassified archives. There won't be someone who will, show you his personnel files. There are little glimpses of the personnel files in first person, this campaign biography that Julia mentioned. So there is a little description of how his personnel records indicated that he was a hothead and that he was being held back in part for that. But then the question is, and there's this funny moment, which is in another untrustworthy source, but Marcus Wolf, the legendary East German spy master, he had this thing about Putin when Putin first got on the scene and would say these things in press interviews in 1999, 2000, where he's like, this is not a high flyer. This is not someone we, the Stasi, viewed as an important counterpart. And then at one point he even says that the award that was in first person that Putin was saying was part of his, his glorious service, he says, like, they gave that to the cleaning people.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
Mike Nelson with Carnegie. I want to commend you for this, and I'm not only looking forward to the book, I'm looking forward to the movie and the video game. I note that in the picture there, he's not wearing a shirt, but he is wearing a cross. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about how he's manipulated or used the Orthodox Church and has the Russian Orthodox Church leader cheerleading for him. American politicians often try to wrap themselves in the church as well, but he seems to have gone to another level. How did he do that?
So I'm glad you brought this up, Mike, and this is one of my favorite parts of the book, and I'm going to do another big shout out to Brian Brown, because this to me is like one of the most brilliant parts of the book. I'm just going to take everyone back to 2011, 2012, when we had street demonstrations. I think you were in Moscow at the time, and you had this great picture of the little kid on the tricycle at the street protest. So you had the most, serious manifestation of discontent from the biggest beneficiaries of the Putin regime on the streets of Moscow, saying, we don't like the way you're reinstalling yourself as president, and we don't like the way you manipulate elections, give us, some shred of dignity. And around this time, Pussy Riot shows up and does their stunt at the biggest Orthodox cathedral in Moscow. And they go on trial, and there's this outcry inside the Kremlin's designated proxy world of how defiling the church is unholy, and un-Russian. And Brian, I'll just show another one of these things that Brian did. But basically, it was a perfect moment for the Kremlin to say, anyone who wants democracy, anybody who doesn't like the way this place is being run, is like Pussy Riot. They are un-Russian. They are LGBT or Western, tools of George Soros. Like, they're not us. They're not at the Ninash. They're not part of our Russian cultural sphere. And that was an act in many ways. It was something that this kind of moral family values, moral conservatism, all that was a way to create wedges in Russian society and get this Joe Sixpack base electorate for Putin on side, and to portray anyone else as something that had to be viewed as an agent of Russia's enemies overseas. And the final part of this, which is a metaphor that one of our colleagues, Andrei Klesnikov, uses all the time, is that because Russia is a besieged fortress and surrounded by these enemies, there's one solution to prevent Russia being laid low again, and that's to throw in with Vladimir Putin. And so all of these motifs are super cynical and not backed up by lifestyle choices of the Russian elite or the way they conduct their personal affairs. But what's also really striking, and this is a big theme of the book, is around this time, American cultural conservatives and others in the West start latching on to Putin, both because of the strongman image as well as all this purported moral conservatism. And they're not really in on the joke. And they don't seem to understand that the person that they think Putin is isn't the real Putin. And that the Russian church and all these other kind of proxy agents for the state who are cultivating them, like the NRA and the Tea Party activists and the members of the Trump MAGA universe who all get taken in by this, they're not in on the joke either. And that's a big part of the way the book.
The World Congress of Families.
Yes, exactly. And at some point, the other part of the Russian, elite also drink in a lot of this messaging. And so now their, demonstrations of piety and orthodoxy and all that are now very much there. And you see this in the most horrible manifestation in the war in Ukraine, where people are portraying it as a holy war, and that as if that this is now, what the real Christian sort of calling of Russians is to go fight and slaughter, a brethren people next door, which is insane.
John Lippman from Voice of America. At what point in the writing process does the artist take over from the editorial side, or how much collaboration was there in the selection of the images?
So as I wrote it as a series of sketches, basically. So each page is basically a scene, and then so I'm writing in 2-page scenes of like each facing page. That was, every single part of the book is basically one set of facing pages. And I gave Brian some direction about use this or don't use this, and I was like, no dancing bears, no Matryoshka dolls, no visual cliches. Like, let's not put any of that stuff into the book. And then Brian's just a genius and came up with his own invented reality. And so the best illustration of that was I'd given him the cover of a book it was a memoir by someone who had served in Dresden with Putin, and sort of describes what life was like in this podunk little office where the 6 KGB operatives were living. And the cover is this haunting image of mist and fog around the Berlin Wall. And then Brian just like stuck Putin in it. And you see him sort of skulking around in his little parka there. And so to me, part of what was so fun about this is Brian's visual language. Brian, for people who don't know him, is a successful graphic novelist who's written books on Andre the Giant, on Andy Kaufman, the American comedic actor, the history of Tetris. He has never drawn someone else's book. And his book style writing is super minimalist and different than a lot of the graphic novels that I grew up reading. It doesn't look like the hard-boiled 50s noir style of The Watchmen or things like that. And so just to watch him be creative was like, I just needed to sit back, basically, and let Brian do his thing.
Take one more, and then.
Thank you. My name is Sasha Stone. I'm a senior program officer at the Center for European Policy Analysis. You talked about how the mystique around Putin is a feature, not a bug, of the regime. And I was curious, in your opinion, what is one of the most persistent myths about Putin that we see here in the West? And why do you think that is?
Probably the biggest myth is that Putin's thinking 2 or 3 moves ahead. And that there's like an endpoint and there's a set of goals, and that everyone who works for him knows what those are. Instead, I think you see point taken. And then, the world is somehow, we just need to figure that out. And if we understood what the talking points were that had been distributed to all levels of the Russian government, that we could somehow disentangle all the problems that Putin's creating. I don't think that's the case. And we need to be aware of how unruly and disruptive dealing with Russia is. And that is, again, a feature, not a bug of the system. And they want to create this image that it's like a big pyramid and that it's really orderly and there's this, this chieftain, or, in Russian there's a really good word, pakhan, which basically means like the boss, kind of like boss of bosses, sitting at the top. And that's true. There's a lot of over-centralization of authority. But every day, we see different competing wings of, and actually, let me show one more of these great things Brian drew, but to sort of depict this, and there was a great Harvard historian, Ned Keenan, who was a historian of medieval Russia. But in Brian's rendering, there's just this way to understand that because Russia doesn't have real institutions and there's no trust, I'm sorry, let me do that properly. Everything's so heavily personalistic, and you don't really know what's expected of you. You just kind of know like there's a guy up above you that you need to keep happy. And there's another image that I used in the book of this black notebook, and that basically Putin is, the job of being the leader of Russia is to have this little notebook that has the 200 side deals that he's cut with the people who matter in the country. And as long as he sort of keeps those 200 things straight, it's okay. And that people will basically fall in line. And then you have the apparatus of coercion and other things for anyone who thinks they're not willing to follow direction and know better. And that's the last thing I'll say, it's kind of random. One of the things that was most striking about the reaction to the war in Russian society was when the people that Julia and I know, the younger, more worldly segment of Russian society, got up and said, this war is horrible, and we need to protest, we need to stop this war. The older generation of Russians were like, you need to shut up, and you need to basically check it at the door, kid. Like, it's not your place to challenge the decisions that are made in this society. And that is this kind of like, just like the creativity and the entrepreneurial spirit of Russia is being crushed by that, sort of self-policing mechanism that's inside Russian society today.
On that extremely cheerful note, why is it that every event about Russia ends on such a cheerful note? I feel like we should go do vodka shots.
You're on. Yeah, you're on.
Anyway, thank you so much to everyone for coming. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Thank you to Andrew for writing this book. I know several young people that I want to give this book to in the coming holiday season. And I hope you all will too.
And there's a reception and some books for sale. So if people want to stick around, we've got treats upstairs.
And you'll be signing,
And
yes?
I'll be signing the book. So thank you all
Amazing.
so much for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Julia. That was
Thank
great.
you.
So much
This is
fun.
awesome.
Thank you.
I'm seriously, I have